A family's dream vacation turns into a public nightmare at 30,000 feet. On a sold-out flight from New York to London, the Thompson family found themselves the target of a flight crew determined to make their journey miserable. Accusations flew, rules were invented, and security was called to forcibly remove them. The lead flight attendant sneered, thinking she was dealing with just another disruptive family. She was wrong. She had no idea that the calm, composed woman in seat 2A wasn't just a mother. She was a guardian of the nation's highest laws, and the gavel of justice was about to fall. The hum of the JFK International Airport terminal was a familiar symphony of controlled chaos. Suitcases wheeled by announcements echoed overhead, and the scent of coffee and jet fuel hung in the air. For Justice Audrey Thompson, it was the perfect overture to a long overdue escape. For the past 9 months, her life had been a whirlwind of legal briefs, oral arguments, and the immense soul-crushing weight of interpreting the Constitution for a nation of over 300 million people. Now, for 2 glorious weeks, she was just Audrey wife to Daniel, mother to 14-year-old Maya and 10-year-old Caleb. Her husband, Daniel, a successful architect whose calm and steady presence was the anchor of their family, navigated them through the priority check-in line for Global Air Flight 110 to London. He glanced at Audrey, a soft smile playing on his lips. "You look a decade younger already," he murmured, tucking a stray braid behind her ear. Audrey leaned into his touch, a genuine, unburdened smile gracing her face. "That's because for the next 14 days, my most difficult ruling will be deciding between the beach and the pool." Their children, Maya and Caleb, were buzzing with an energy that could power the entire terminal. Maya, with her sketchbook clutched in her hand, was already mentally designing a new Buckingham Palace, while Caleb was debating whether the Tower of London ghosts were scarier than the ones in his video games. They were good kids, bright, respectful, and well-traveled. They knew the etiquette of flying better than many adults. The family, dressed in comfortable but smart travel attire, presented their passports and first-class tickets at the gate. The agent barely looked up, her movements mechanical, as she scanned their documents and waved them through. So far, so normal. They settled into their spacious pods in the first-class cabin. 1A and 1B for the kids, and 2A and 2B for Audrey and Daniel, directly behind them. The cabin was an oasis of muted greys and polished chrome, a stark contrast to the bustling airport they had just left. As the other passengers trickled in, Audrey noticed the subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere. It started with the senior flight attendant, a woman in her late 50s with a severe blonde bob and a name tag that read Karen Miller. Karen greeted the white passengers ahead of them with beaming smiles and cheerful offers to hang their coats. When she reached the Thompson family, her smile didn't just fade. It vanished, replaced by a tight professional mask that failed to conceal a flicker of something cold and appraising in her eyes. "May I see your boarding passes again?" she asked, her tone clipped. Daniel, ever the diplomat, simply smiled and handed them over. "Of course. Here you go." Karen scrutinized the passes for a moment, too long her eyes darting from the names on the tickets to their faces, as if searching for a discrepancy that wasn't there. Finally, she handed them back without a word and moved on. Daniel and Audrey exchanged a brief, knowing look. It was a look they had shared countless times over the years, a silent acknowledgement of a familiar, wearying prejudice. They wouldn't let it spoil their trip. A younger flight attendant, Mark, came by, offering pre-departure drinks. He served the couple across the aisle with a flourish, then approached the Thompsons. "Orange juice or water?" he asked, not making eye contact with the parents, but instead looking at Maya and Caleb. "I'll have a sparkling water, please," Audrey said, her voice calm and clear. Mark seemed momentarily flustered, as if he hadn't expected the adults to speak. He retrieved the water, placing it on her tray with a curt nod before quickly moving away. The small slights began to accumulate like pebbles in a shoe. When Daniel asked for a place to stow his architectural drawings, which were in a protective tube, Karen told him there was no more space in the closets, despite having just placed a much larger garment bag inside for another passenger. Daniel found a spot in the overhead bin himself, quietly and without complaint. When Maya accidentally dropped her pen and it rolled a few feet down the aisle, Karen picked it up with a theatrical sigh and a muttered comment about keeping your things in your own space. Audrey felt a familiar tension coiling in her gut, but she pushed it down. She was on vacation. This was her time to decompress, to shed the immense responsibility of her professional life. She would not allow the quiet hostility of one flight attendant to chip away at her peace. She opened her novel determined to lose herself in its pages. The plane pushed back from the gate, and the safety video began to play. Caleb, a nervous flyer, had his headphones on, listening to music to calm himself. His volume was low. Audrey could barely hear the faint, tinny beat from her seat. But for Karen Miller it was an opportunity. She marched over to their row. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the cabin's low hum. She wasn't addressing Audrey or Daniel, but was looking directly at Caleb. "The safety demonstration is a mandatory requirement. You need to remove your headphones and pay attention." Daniel intervened immediately, his voice low but firm. "He's a little anxious about flying. The music helps. He's seen the demonstration dozens of times, I assure you. It is a federal aviation regulation that all passengers must be able to hear crew instructions." Karen retorted, her voice rising in volume, drawing glances from nearby passengers. "He needs to take them off. Now." There was no such specific regulation about headphones during the safety video, especially when the screens were providing visual instructions, but arguing the point would only escalate the situation. Audrey gave Caleb a reassuring nod. "It's okay, sweetie. Take them off for a few minutes." Caleb complied, his face flushing with embarrassment. Karen stood there, arms crossed, watching him until the headphones were fully off and placed on his seat. She gave a curt, satisfied nod and walked away. The plane took off, ascending into the vast blue expanse. As they leveled off at cruising altitude, Audrey tried once more to relax, but the calm she had so desperately sought felt distant and unattainable. The beautiful quiet cabin no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a courtroom where her family was being judged, and the verdict had already been decided. The storm had not yet broken, but the air was thick with its coming, a palpable tension that promised the flight to London would be anything but peaceful. Once the seatbelt sign was switched off, the first-class service was supposed to begin. It was one of the perks Daniel had insisted on, a way to start their vacation with a touch of luxury and ease. But for the Thompson family, it became another theater for Karen Miller's escalating campaign of targeted disrespect, subtly aided by her colleague Mark. The purser, a man named George, made his way through the cabin, taking meal orders. He was polite if a bit distant. When he got to the Thompsons, he took their orders efficiently and moved on. It was Karen who delivered the meals, and her service was a masterclass in passive aggression. While other passengers received their meals with a "Mr. Smith, your seared salmon," or "Mrs. Davis, the Chardonnay you requested," the Thompsons' plates were placed on their trays with a clatter and a terse "Here's your chicken," or the beef. No honorifics, no eye contact. Just the bare minimum of service delivered with maximum disdain. When Daniel requested a wine pairing suggestion from the menu, Karen simply shrugged. "They're all on the list. Just pick one." She then walked over to the passenger in 3D, a white businessman, and spent 5 minutes animatedly discussing the bouquet of the Cabernet Sauvignon versus the Merlot. Audrey observed it all, her legal mind cataloguing each incident, each slight, each deviation from professional conduct. It was a pattern. This wasn't a case of a flight attendant having a bad day. This was deliberate, targeted behavior. She saw the hurt and confusion in her children's eyes. Maya had stopped sketching her notebook lying closed on her lap. Caleb was withdrawn, staring out the window, his earlier excitement completely extinguished. "Dad," Maya whispered, leaning across the aisle. "Why is she being so mean to us?" Daniel's heart ached. He reached over and squeezed her hand. "Some people just have a little less kindness in their hearts, sweetie. Don't you worry about her. We're not going to let her ruin our trip." But Karen seemed determined to do just that. An hour into the flight, Caleb started to feel a bit airsick. It was common for him on long-haul flights. Audrey always came prepared. She pulled a small vial of a doctor-prescribed anti-nausea medication from her purse. It was a liquid she'd normally mix with a small amount of ginger ale to make it more palatable for him. She pressed the call button. Mark appeared. "Yes. Could I please get a small glass of ginger ale for my son? He's feeling a bit unwell," Audrey asked politely. Mark glanced at Caleb, his expression a mixture of annoyance and suspicion. "We've already completed the main beverage service. We'll be coming through with water later." "I understand," Audrey said, keeping her voice even. "But he needs it now for his medication. Just a small amount would be greatly appreciated." Mark sighed dramatically. "I'll see what I can do." He disappeared into the galley. Several minutes passed. The passenger in 3D pressed his call button, and Karen appeared instantly with a fresh glass of whiskey on a silver tray. Still no ginger ale. Daniel stood up. At 6'2", his presence was commanding, yet his demeanor remained calm. He walked to the galley. The curtain was slightly ajar, and he could hear Karen and Mark talking. "Making all these special requests. It's first class, not their private jet," Mark was saying. "I knew they'd be trouble the moment I saw them," Karen replied, her voice low and venomous. "People like them are always looking for a handout or a reason to complain." Daniel's blood ran cold. He pushed the curtain aside. Both flight attendants froze their faces, a mask of shock at being caught. "My wife asked for a ginger ale for our sick child 10 minutes ago," Daniel said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I believe that falls well within the scope of first-class service. Or is that amenity reserved only for certain passengers?" Caught red-handed, Karen's face flushed with anger. She snatched a can of ginger ale from the cart and poured it messily into a plastic cup, shoving it into his hand. "Here," she snapped. Daniel took the cup and returned to his seat without another word. The mask of civility had been ripped away. This was no longer about poor service. It was a hostile environment, and his family was the target. The rest of the flight descended into a series of bizarre and petty provocations. When Maya got up to use the lavatory, Mark stepped into the aisle, blocking her path, pretending to organize a service cart, forcing her to stand and wait awkwardly for a full minute before he moved. When Caleb, feeling better after his medicine, tried to watch a movie, his entertainment system mysteriously malfunctioned. Karen came over, pressed a few buttons with exaggerated force, and declared it broken. "You'll just have to be patient," she said, without a hint of apology. Daniel, who was tech-savvy, reached over a few minutes later and performed a simple system reset, and the screen flickered back to life. The final straw came about 4 hours into the flight. The cabin was dark, most passengers were sleeping or watching movies with headphones on. Caleb, unable to sleep, was playing a game on his tablet. The volume was off and he was wearing his headphones. The only light came from the soft glow of his screen. Karen Miller stormed down the aisle and stopped at their row, her hands on her hips. "I need you to turn that off," she commanded, her voice loud enough to startle the sleeping passenger in the row ahead. Audrey looked up from her book. "I'm sorry, is there a problem? His headphones are on and the device is in airplane mode." "The light from that screen is disturbing other passengers," Karen declared. Audrey glanced around the darkened cabin. The only person who could possibly be disturbed was the passenger in front of Caleb, who was fast asleep with an eye mask on. No one else had even stirred. "Who exactly is it disturbing?" Audrey asked, her voice retaining its judicial calm, yet with an underlying edge of steel. "I've had a complaint," Karen lied, her eyes narrowed. "It is my job to ensure the comfort of all my passengers. Now turn it off, or I will have to confiscate it until we land." The threat was so absurd, so blatantly aggressive, that Daniel had to physically restrain himself from reacting. Confiscate their child's property. "That won't be necessary," Daniel said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "You've made your point." He looked at Caleb, his heart breaking for his son. "Caleb, just put it away for now, son. Try to get some sleep." Caleb, looking utterly defeated, turned off his tablet. Tears welled in his eyes as he curled up under his blanket. Audrey watched him, and in that moment something shifted within her. She was no longer just Audrey, the wife and mother, trying to keep the peace. The quiet authority, the unassailable composure she possessed in the nation's highest court, began to surface. Karen Miller had not just insulted her family, she had created a hostile, discriminatory environment and had now lied to enforce her own prejudiced will. This was no longer a customer service issue. It was an abuse of authority. And Justice Audrey Thompson knew a thing or two about authority and its proper and improper use. She looked at Karen, her gaze direct and unflinching. The flight attendant mistook her silence for submission. It was a grave miscalculation. The confrontation over Caleb's tablet was the breaking point. The charade was over. Daniel and Audrey knew they could no longer ignore the crew's behavior. It had gone from microaggressions to outright harassment, and their children were bearing the brunt of it. Daniel pressed the call button. He was done dealing with Karen and Mark. He wanted to speak to the purser, the person in charge of the cabin crew. George, the purser, arrived a few moments later, his expression one of weary impatience. "Is there a problem?" "Yes, there is." Daniel began, his voice low and steady, trying not to disturb the other passengers. "We have been subjected to unprofessional and hostile treatment by two of your flight attendants, Karen and Mark, since we boarded this aircraft. My son has been repeatedly singled out, we've been denied basic service, and we were just lied to and threatened by Ms. Miller. We are deeply concerned about the discriminatory nature of this behavior." George listened, his face impassive. He glanced over at Karen, who was standing by the galley, watching them with a smug, defiant look on her face. "Sir," George said, his tone condescending, "our crew is highly professional. Perhaps there has been a misunderstanding. The flight attendants are simply enforcing airline policy to ensure everyone's comfort and safety." "There is no misunderstanding," Audrey interjected, her voice cutting through the air with quiet precision. "We are well versed in airline policy. We were not violating any policy. Your flight attendant, Ms. Miller, fabricated a complaint about our son's tablet to harass him. This came after a series of other targeted incidents. We are asking you, as the purser, to address this with your staff." George's eyes flickered with annoyance. It was clear he had no intention of reining in his crew. He was siding with them. "I've spoken to the crew," he said dismissively. "They have reported that your family has been disruptive from the beginning, making excessive demands and refusing to follow instructions." It was a stunning, outrageous lie. Daniel felt a surge of pure rage, but Audrey put a calming hand on his arm. Her expression was now one of intense focus. the look of a judge listening to a deeply flawed and perjurious testimony. "That is a patently false accusation," Daniel said, his voice trembling slightly with anger. "We have done nothing of the sort." "Well, it's your word against that of 2 senior crew members," George said with a shrug. "And now I have other passengers who have complained about your family causing a scene." He gestured vaguely to the cabin where most people were still asleep or oblivious. This was their strategy to escalate, to lie, and to paint the victims as the aggressors. Karen chose that moment to walk over, positioning herself as a united front with her superior. "George, is everything all right?" she asked, her voice dripping with false concern. "Are these passengers causing more trouble?" "They seem to be," George replied, crossing his arms. "I'm afraid their behavior is becoming a security concern." The term security concern was a loaded one, a weaponized phrase designed to shut down any argument and grant the crew immense power. Audrey knew exactly what they were doing. "Let me be very clear," Audrey said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet each word carried immense weight. "There is no security concern. The only concern here is the unprofessional and discriminatory conduct of your staff, which you are now enabling." Karen sneered. "I've had enough of this. You think because you're in first class you can do whatever you want. I am the senior flight attendant on this aircraft, and I am telling you that your behavior is unacceptable. I am recommending to the captain that you be restrained and met by authorities upon landing." The threat was so disproportionate, so wildly out of line with reality, that it was almost surreal. Maya started to cry silently, burying her face in her father's arm. Caleb was pale with fear. "You can't do that," Daniel exclaimed, his voice finally rising. "We haven't done anything." "Oh, I can," Karen said, her eyes glittering with a perverse sense of victory. "In fact, I think we need to deal with this now. We can't have you disrupting the flight for another 3 hours. She turned to George. "I want them removed from this flight. Now." George, seeing his authority now fully challenged, made a fatal decision. Instead of de-escalating, he doubled down to back his crew. "I agree. I'm going to wake the captain. We're going to divert." Divert a transatlantic flight. The idea was insane. It would cost the airline hundreds of thousands of dollars in fuel landing fees and passenger compensation, all because a flight attendant had a personal prejudice against a black family. George disappeared into the cockpit. A few minutes later, he returned with Captain Stevens, a man in his late 50s with a stern, tired face, clearly displeased at being woken. "What is all this?" Captain Stevens demanded, his eyes scanning the Thompson family. Karen launched into a dramatic, falsified account of the flight. She painted the Thompsons as argumentative, entitled, and non-compliant from the moment they boarded. She claimed they had refused to follow safety instructions, verbally abused her and Mark, and were now posing a threat to the order and safety of the cabin. Mark stood behind her, nodding in agreement, adding his own embellishments. "They are a clear and present problem, Captain," Karen concluded, her voice filled with conviction. "For the safety of this flight and everyone on board, I am formally requesting that they be deplaned. We need to divert to the nearest airport and have them removed." Captain Stevens listened, his expression grim. He was trained to trust his crew, especially his senior flight attendant. He was groggy, annoyed, and wanted the problem solved quickly. He looked at Audrey and Daniel, who were sitting in stunned silence at the sheer audacity of the lies. "Is this true?" the captain asked them, his tone already accusatory. "No, Captain, it is absolutely not true," Daniel said, trying to keep his composure. "We have been the ones subjected to harassment. Your crew is lying." "Everyone says that," Captain Stevens said wearily. "I have a report from my purser, and my senior flight attendant. I don't have time to conduct a trial at 35,000 feet. My crew feels the situation is untenable." He made a decision. It was the wrong one. "We won't be diverting. The cost is too prohibitive," he said, much to Karen's visible disappointment. "But we will be having a conversation on the ground. I'm calling ahead to have airport security and airline representatives meet the aircraft at the gate in London. I expect your full cooperation, as you will be escorted off this plane." He then turned to Audrey and Daniel. "Until then, I don't want to hear another word from any of you. Do you understand me? One more peep, and I will have my crew restrain you. You will sit here, and you will be silent." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and went back to the cockpit. The verdict had been delivered. They were to be publicly shamed, escorted off the plane like criminals. Karen Miller stood there for a moment, a triumphant smirk on her face. She had won. She had taken a quiet, respectable family and twisted them into a threat using her authority and the captain's trust to validate her prejudice. The humiliation was a physical weight. Daniel wrapped his arms around his children, trying to shield them from the glares of the few passengers who had woken up and were now staring at them, believing the crew's narrative. Audrey, however, was no longer looking at Karen. Her gaze was distant, her mind working with cold, swift clarity. She had remained silent through the captain's verdict, a habit ingrained from years on the bench, allowing the other party to state their case fully. They had made their decision based on lies and prejudice. They had abused their authority, and they had done it to the wrong person. The time for quiet de-escalation was over. The time for justice had begun. The next 3 hours were the longest of the Thompson family's life. They sat in a bubble of suffocating silence, the air thick with humiliation and dread. Karen and Mark patrolled the aisle pointedly, ignoring them, but occasionally casting smug, victorious glances in their direction. Other passengers, now aware that something had happened, stared, whispered, and judged. Audrey's children were crushed. Maya hid her face in a blanket, while Caleb just stared blankly at the seat in front of him, his small shoulders slumped in defeat. Daniel's hands were clenched into fists in his lap. Every fiber of his being screamed to stand up, to shout, to defend his family's honor. But he looked at Audrey and saw a stillness that was not surrender. It was the calm at the eye of a hurricane. Her expression was unreadable, her posture perfect, her gaze fixed on a point far away. He trusted her. He had seen this look before, in moments of immense professional pressure. It was the look of a woman preparing to dismantle an opposing argument piece by piece until nothing was left but the undeniable truth. As the plane began its initial descent into London, Heathrow an announcement crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we prepare for landing, we ask that you remain in your seats after the plane has come to a complete stop at the gate. Local authorities will be boarding the aircraft to deal with a security issue. We thank you for your patience." The security issue was them. The announcement was a public branding, the final act of their humiliation. The plane touched down smoothly, taxiing for what felt like an eternity before finally docking at the gate. The engine spooled down. The seatbelt sign pinged off. But no one moved. An anxious silence filled the cabin. Through the window, Audrey could see them waiting on the jet bridge, 2 uniformed airport police officers, and a stern-looking woman in a Global Air corporate suit clutching a clipboard. Karen Miller stood at the front of the cabin, arms crossed, ready to present the problem passengers to the authorities. She looked proud, vindicated. The cockpit door opened, and Captain Stevens emerged, followed by the purser, George. The captain nodded to Karen, then addressed the Thompson family, his voice loud and clear for all to hear. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, as I instructed you, will now be escorted off the aircraft. Please gather your personal belongings and follow me." Daniel took a deep breath and began to help the children get their things, his movements stiff with anger and shame. But Audrey did not move. She did not reach for her bag. She simply looked up at Captain Stevens, her gaze level and clear. "Captain," she said, her voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable authority that made him pause. "Before we go anywhere, I suggest you listen to me very carefully." The captain was taken aback by her tone. "Ma'am, there is nothing left to discuss. You can take it up with our ground staff." "You are making a grave mistake, Captain Stevens," Audrey continued, her voice, never rising yet. It commanded the attention of everyone within earshot. "You have accepted a false narrative from a prejudiced crew, and in doing so, you have failed in your primary duty, which is the safety and security of all your passengers. You have allowed your cabin to become a hostile environment for my family, based on nothing more than the color of our skin." Karen scoffed audibly. "Oh, here we go, playing the race card." Audrey's eyes shifted to Karen, and for the first time, her gaze was not just calm, it was glacial. "Ms. Miller, your conduct today has been not only unprofessional, but also potentially illegal. You have engaged in discriminatory practices, you have lied to your superior officer, and you have needlessly terrorized my children. You are a liability to your airline and a disgrace to your profession." The captain's face hardened. "That's enough. I will not have you insulting my crew." "It is not an insult, Captain. It is a statement of fact," Audrey said. She then turned her attention back to him. "You chose not to conduct a proper investigation. You chose to believe a fabricated story without seeking a single piece of corroborating evidence. You threatened a family with restraint and publicly shamed them. You are about to hand us over to law enforcement based on a false report. I am giving you one final opportunity to reconsider your course of action." Captain Stevens was incredulous. "And who are you to give me an opportunity?" he asked with a condescending laugh. "Who do you think you are?" Audrey held his gaze. She reached slowly into her handbag, the one she had not yet touched, and pulled out a small, leather bifold wallet. She didn't flash it. She opened it with deliberate, unhurried grace. Inside, nestled in worn leather, was a gold-embossed credential. She didn't hand it to him. She simply held it for him to see. Her voice was steady, devoid of anger or triumph. It was the voice of a judge delivering a final, unappealable ruling. "My name," she said, enunciating each syllable with perfect clarity, "is Audrey Althea Thompson. I am an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States." Silence. A profound, echoing, absolute silence fell over the first-class cabin. The words hung in the air, seeming to suck all the oxygen out of the plane. Captain Stevens stared at the credential, his eyes widening in disbelief. He leaned closer, reading the official script, seeing the unmistakable seal of the highest court in the land. The blood drained from his face. Karen Miller's smug expression dissolved into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. Her mouth hung open a silent "oh" of shock. Mark, standing behind her, looked like he was about to faint. George the purser took an involuntary step backward, as if physically struck by the words. The captain staggered back, his professional composure completely shattered. A Supreme Court justice. He had threatened a Supreme Court justice. He had accepted the lies of his crew and was about to have a sitting member of the United States Supreme Court frog-marched off his plane by police. The full catastrophic weight of his misjudgment crashed down on him. This was not just a customer service complaint that would be handled by a ground agent. This was an international incident. This was a career-ending, airline-destroying cataclysm. "Oh my God." He whispered the words barely audible. He looked from the credential back to Audrey's face, seeing her not as a problem passenger, but as who she was, one of the most powerful and respected legal figures in the world. And he saw the truth. He saw the quiet dignity she had maintained through hours of abuse. He saw the protective love for her family. He saw the lie in his crew's eyes. Audrey calmly closed the wallet and returned it to her purse. "Now, Captain," she said, her voice still quiet, but now it resonated with the power of her office. "Let's talk about what happens next. You will dismiss the officers on the jet bridge. You will have the corporate representative from your airline meet me my husband and a representative from the U.S. Embassy, which I will be calling in 5 minutes. And you will ensure that Ms. Miller, Mr. Johnson," she said, glancing at Mark's forgotten name tag, "and George, your purser, do not leave this aircraft until their statements have been taken. Is that understood?" It was not a question. It was an order. Captain Stevens, pale and trembling, could only nod mutely. The gavel had fallen, and the shockwaves were just beginning. The atmosphere on Global Air Flight 110 transformed from a stage of public humiliation to the scene of a catastrophic implosion. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been inverted with the force of a tectonic event. Captain Stevens, his face ashen, stumbled to the aircraft door. He spoke in a hushed, frantic tone to the corporate representative and the police officers who had been waiting expectantly on the jet bridge. From her seat, Audrey could see the initial confusion on their faces, followed by wide-eyed shock as the captain explained the magnitude of the situation. The police officers exchanged a look of disbelief and relief, clearly glad to have been stopped from arresting a U.S. Supreme Court justice. They quickly and quietly departed. The corporate agent, a woman named Susan Pritchard, looked as though she had seen a ghost. She fumbled with her phone, her hands shaking as she began making a series of panicked calls. Inside the plane, the remaining first-class passengers who had witnessed the entire exchange were now murmuring in stunned silence. The story was already taking shape in their minds, ready to be relayed to friends, family, and social media the moment they deplaned. Captain Stevens returned to the cabin, avoiding Audrey's gaze. He looked at Karen, Mark, and George, who were huddled together near the galley, their faces a mixture of terror and disbelief. The sneering arrogance was gone, replaced by the raw fear of people who knew their lives had just been irrevocably ruined. "Stay here, don't move, don't talk to anyone," the captain ordered them, his voice a ragged whisper. He then approached Audrey's seat, his entire posture one of profound deference and regret. "Justice Thompson," he began, his voice cracking, I cannot express how sorry I am. There are no words. I was unprofessional. I failed in my duty. I offer my deepest, most sincere apologies to you and your entire family." Audrey looked at him, her expression unyielding. "Your apology is noted, Captain, but an apology does not undo the harm that was done. Your failure was not just one of unprofessionalism. It was a failure of judgment, of leadership, and of basic human decency. You allowed prejudice to command your aircraft." Daniel, seeing his children were safe from any further threat, now let his own cold anger surface. "You stood there and called my family a security issue in front of an entire plane," he said, his voice low and seething. "You let your crew terrorize my children for hours. An apology doesn't begin to cover it." The captain flinched as if struck. "You are right. You are absolutely right," he conceded, utterly broken. Soon after, Susan Pritchard, the ground manager, boarded the aircraft. Her face was pale, her professional smile plastered on like a flimsy bandage on a mortal wound. "Justice Thompson, Mr. Thompson," she began, her voice trembling slightly. I am Susan Pritchard, the station manager for Global Air at Heathrow. On behalf of the entire airline, I am so sorry for the horrific experience you have had. We are appalled." Audrey simply nodded her silence, more unnerving than any outburst would have been. "Ms. Pritchard, I have made a call to the US Embassy. A representative will be here shortly. My family and I will deplane, and we will give our statements. I expect Global Air to secure the flight data recorder, all cabin surveillance footage, and to ensure that the crew members involved are detained for a full and transparent investigation." "Of course, Justice. Absolutely. Anything you need." Susan stammered, frantically taking notes. The deplaning process was surreal. The other passengers were finally allowed to leave, and as they filed past, many of them, the same ones who had been staring with suspicion just minutes before, now offered looks of sympathy and awe. One businessman leaned over to Daniel and whispered, "I'm so sorry you went through that. What they did was disgusting." Once the cabin was empty, except for the disgraced crew, and the captain, Audrey, and her family were escorted off the plane. Waiting for them in a private lounge were not only senior Global Air executives who had been scrambled from their homes, but also a calm, professional man named Robert Jennings from the US Embassy's consular section. The interrogation began, though it felt more like a deposition. Audrey and Daniel recounted the events of the flight with methodical, dispassionate precision. They detailed every slight, every lie, every act of harassment, from the moment they boarded to the captain's final threat. Maya, feeling safe now, even offered her own account of how Karen had muttered under her breath, and Mark had blocked her way to the lavatory. As they spoke, the faces of the Global Air executives went from pale to ghostly white. They were not just hearing a customer complaint, they were hearing a meticulously constructed legal case being laid out by one of the sharpest legal minds on the planet. Meanwhile, back on the aircraft, the crew was being sequestered. Their dream trip layover in London had evaporated, replaced by an indefinite grounding and a terrifying internal investigation. The news had already rocketed up the corporate ladder, landing on the desk of Global Air's CEO, James Hogan, a man known for his ruthless focus on the company's brand and stock price. He was awakened by a call in the middle of the night in New York. The words "Supreme Court Justice" and "discriminatory incident" sent a jolt of pure ice through his veins. In her first call from the ground, Susan Pritchard had informed the corporate office of the identity of the passenger. The panic was instantaneous. The legal department was convened for an emergency call at 3 a.m. The PR department was put on high alert, preparing for the inevitable media firestorm. This was a code black event, the worst-case scenario for any airline. It wasn't just about a lawsuit. It was about the potential for congressional hearings, federal investigations, and irreparable damage to their global brand. Back in the lounge, the initial shock for Karen, Mark, and George was hardening into a desperate, frantic attempt at self-preservation. When they were finally interviewed separately by the airline's security team, their stories began to fall apart. Karen stuck to her guns, initially repeating her lies about the Thompsons being disruptive. But under pointed questioning, cracks appeared. There were no other passenger complaints on record. Not one. Her claim about the tablet light was easily disproven by the seating chart. Mark, younger and less steely than Karen, crumbled almost immediately. Fearing for his job and potential legal repercussions, he admitted that things might have been misunderstood. He confessed that Karen had been complaining about the Thompson family from the beginning, and that he had gone along with it. George the purser tried to play the role of the ignorant manager, claiming he was just responding to his crew's concerns. But his failure to intervene to question their story or to de-escalate the situation made him complicit. The evidence was overwhelming. It was a clear-cut case of prejudice leading to a gross abuse of authority. By sunrise in London, the initial reports were on the CEO's desk. The recommendation from the legal team was swift and brutal, immediate and decisive action. There could be no ambiguity, no appearance of defending the indefensible. The priority was not to save the employees. It was to save the airline. The reckoning was just beginning, and it was going to be merciless. The fallout from Flight 110 was not a slow burn. It was a detonation. By the time the Thompson family had been settled into a suite at the Savoy, with apologies flowing from every level of Global Air's corporate structure, the story had already begun to leak. A passenger from first class, a well-known tech blogger, had posted a detailed first-hand account on Twitter. He hadn't known the family's identity at first, only describing them as a dignified black family being horrifically harassed by the crew. He ended his thread with the stunning reveal he'd witnessed. And the mother. She was a freaking Supreme Court justice. The post went viral in minutes. By mid-morning in London, Dashocho Global Air shame was the #1 trending topic worldwide. News outlets from CNN to the BBC to The Guardian picked up the story, and it was the lead item on every major news network. The narrative was devastatingly clear. A major international airlines crew had engaged in racist harassment of a black family, who in a twist of karmic fate happened to include one of the most powerful women in the United States. For Global Air CEO James Hogan, it was a waking nightmare. The company's stock price began to plummet in pre-market trading. Their carefully cultivated image of sophisticated inclusive travel was being torched in the court of public opinion. He convened an emergency board meeting. The message was unequivocal: this could not be managed with a simple apology. They needed to perform a corporate exorcism. The first heads to roll were those of the crew. Karen Miller, Mark Johnson, and George the purser were summarily fired before they had even been allowed to leave the airport hotel they were sequestered in. The termination notices cited gross misconduct, discriminatory behavior, and endangerment of the airline's reputation. Their employee credentials were revoked, their future flights cancelled. In a single morning, 3 careers were vaporized. For Karen Miller, the news was a shock she refused to accept. For over 30 years, Global Air had been her identity. She believed she was a top-tier professional, a guardian of order and civility in the skies. In her mind, she had done nothing wrong. She had simply been enforcing standards. The idea that her judgment, her very character, was being condemned was incomprehensible. She called her union representative screaming about wrongful termination, but the union, seeing the public relations tsunami and the irrefutable evidence, quietly informed her that her case was indefensible. They would not be fighting for her. Captain Stevens's fate was more complex. He hadn't instigated the harassment, but his catastrophic failure of leadership had enabled it and brought the airline to the brink of ruin. He was immediately suspended without pay and grounded indefinitely pending a full FAA review, which the airline itself requested. His pilot's license was in jeopardy. His sterling, decades-long career was likely over. The guilt he felt was immense, but it was overshadowed by the professional consequences. He had trusted his crew, and that trust had led him to ruin. The corporate response was swift and sweeping. James Hogan scheduled a press conference for that afternoon. He didn't send a subordinate. He went himself. His expression was grim, his tone somber. He issued a full, unreserved, and humiliating public apology to Justice Thompson and her family. He didn't mince words. He called the crew's behavior appalling, racist, and an unforgivable betrayal of our values. He announced the immediate termination of the employees involved and the suspension of the captain. But he knew that wouldn't be enough. He also announced a series of immediate actions. 1. A top-to-bottom independent review of the company's anti-discrimination and bias training policies to be led by a respected civil rights organization. 2. The immediate implementation of mandatory enhanced unconscious bias and de-escalation training for all 50,000 of Global Air's frontline employees, from gate agents to pilots. 3. A significant multi-million-dollar donation to several non-profits dedicated to fighting racial injustice. 4. A personal commitment from Hogan himself to meet with Justice Thompson to discuss further systemic reforms. It was a masterstroke of crisis management designed to cauterize the wound and signal to the world that they were taking this with the utmost seriousness. But the damage was done. Boycotts were being organized. Corporate accounts were threatening to pull their business. The name Global Air had become synonymous with racism in the skies. Back in London, the Thompson family tried to salvage their vacation, but the incident cast a long shadow. They were trailed by paparazzi. Their privacy was gone. Daniel was furious not for himself, but for his family. His wife's immense responsibility meant their lives were already under a microscope. This incident had magnified it 1,000 times. His children were subdued, the joy of their planned trip replaced by the anxiety of being at the center of a global news story. Audrey, true to her nature, remained the calm center. She received a call from the Chief Justice and the President, both offering their full support, but she politely declined the offers of official intervention. This was not a matter of state. This was a personal injury that had broader implications, and she intended to handle it with the same methodical approach she applied to law. Her legal team was in contact with Global Airs. The airline's lawyers were expecting a massive 9-figure lawsuit. They were prepared to offer a colossal settlement to make it go away. But Audrey Thompson wasn't interested in money. That was never the point. A payout would be a private resolution to a public problem. It would compensate her family, but it would not fix the underlying disease that had led to their ordeal. She had a different kind of justice in mind. One that couldn't be achieved with a checkbook, but one that would have a far more lasting and meaningful impact. The unraveling at Global Air was just the beginning. The reconstruction was yet to come, and it would be on her terms. In the weeks following the incident on Flight 1110, Global Air found itself in a state of corporate freefall. The story of the harassed Supreme Court justice was a global media sensation, sparking outrage and calls for boycotts. The airline's stock plummeted, and its carefully crafted brand image was left in tatters. CEO James Hogan's public apology and the firing of the crew were necessary first steps, but the crisis was far from over. The real reckoning was yet to come, and it would be dictated by Justice Audrey Thompson herself. The inevitable meeting took place not in a confrontational boardroom, but a quiet, neutral space. Hogan and his legal team came prepared to solve the problem the corporate way, with money. They presented an initial settlement offer of $25 million as a figure they believed was large enough to purchase the family's silence and end the public relations nightmare. Audrey listened to their proposal without interruption. When they finished, her response was quiet and unequivocal. No. The executives were stunned. Justice Thompson. Hogan began, "We are prepared to negotiate." "Mr. Hogan, you misunderstand." Audrey stated, her voice carrying the calm authority of the bench. "We are not here for a financial settlement. You cannot write a check to repair the damage done to my family or to fix the systemic issues that allowed it to happen. We will not be accepting any money." If the initial reveal on the plane was a shock, this was an aftershock that rattled the foundations of their corporate strategy. "Then what is it you want?" Hogan asked, completely off balance. "I want change," Audrey declared. "Real, enforceable and lasting change. Your press releases and new training manuals are fleeting. I want a consent decree overseen by a federal court." The airline's lawyers paled. A consent decree was a serious, long-term commitment that would subject Global Air to years of external oversight. Audrey laid out her terms, which were not punitive, but transformative. She demanded the creation of an independent oversight board to review all discrimination complaints with its findings made public. She insisted that a portion of executive bonuses be tied directly to measurable improvements in diversity and fair treatment. Finally, she required the airline to fund a partnership with a historically black university to create a new pipeline for pilots and executives of color, breaking the old boy network that protected employees like Karen. Faced with a devastating public lawsuit they could never win, Hogan and the board had no alternative. They agreed to every term. The consent decree was signed and filed, making Global Air's reforms a matter of legal record. Justice for Audrey was not personal enrichment, but institutional reform. The consequences for the individuals involved were stark and fitting. Captain Stevens lost his license for 2 years and was forced into a disgraced retirement, forever haunted by his critical failure of judgment. Mark Johnson, the junior flight attendant, found himself blacklisted from the industry, his career ambitions ending behind the counter of a coffee shop. The cruelest fate was reserved for Karen Miller. Fired and stripped of her pension, she remained defiantly unapologetic, viewing herself as the victim. Her wrongful termination lawsuit was laughed out of court. Abandoned by her union and unemployable in any service industry, her life unraveled. The bitterness she had shown to others became her only companion, her days spent in a small, lonely apartment, a prisoner of her own prejudice. 1 year later, the Thompson family finally took their vacation to London. On a different airline, they were greeted by a diverse and professional crew. As a young black flight attendant smiled warmly at her children, Audrey felt a sense of profound peace. The victory wasn't in the downfall of a few hateful people. It was in the system that was now being rebuilt to be better, fairer, and more just. As the plane climbed into the sky, she looked at her family, their laughter filling the cabin, and knew that the true verdict had been rendered not for revenge, but for a future where everyone could fly with dignity. This story serves as a powerful reminder that justice isn't always about what happens in a courtroom. Sometimes it's about the courage to speak truth to power, even when you're miles high in the sky. The Thompson family's ordeal on Flight 110 began with ugly whispered prejudice, but ended with a loud, clear verdict on accountability. It shows that one person's refusal to accept injustice can trigger a wave of change, forcing an entire corporation to confront its failings and rebuild on a foundation of respect. The consequences for the crew were not just karma. They were the direct result of choices they made, proving that character, integrity, and decency are not optional in any profession. If this story of justice and accountability resonated with you, please help us share it by hitting the like button. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next story. And share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of this story stood out to you the most? Your engagement helps our community grow. Thank you for watching.